Mel Gibson understood that The Passion of the Christ was not a production born of typical cinematic ambition. It was a spiritual intrusion that demanded to be told. It did not emerge from a boardroom or a calculated budget, but from an idea that seized his soul and refused to let go until he surrendered to its weight. On the set, the boundaries of the ordinary began to fray. Strange occurrences and sudden, inexplicable shifts in the weather suggested that this was no mere recreation of history. A heavy, watchful presence seemed to linger in the air, a weight so tangible that many crew members still find it difficult to articulate what they experienced during those hours. While the industry saw only a liability that threatened their sense of control, Gibson recognized a divine calling that he could not and would not turn away from. As we peel back the layers of this mystery, we invite you to take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. What forces do you believe were truly moving behind the scenes? Stay with us, for the silence of the tomb is about to be shattered by a light that history itself could not contain. In the late 1990s, Mel Gibson stood at the zenith of Hollywood power, yet behind this facade of absolute control, his internal world was unraveling into shadows. Neither fame nor accolades could fill the void created by addiction and a corrosive depression. His breaking point arrived not with a spectacle, but in the crushing weight of a silent, ordinary day. Driven by jagged desperation, he fell to his knees in prayer, receiving not comfort, but a piercing clarity that had waited in the darkness for a lifetime. From that moment, Scripture exerted a gravitational pull he could no longer resist. Gibson became obsessed with the themes of suffering and surrender, specifically the final, agonizing hours of the Messiah. He felt a divine compulsion to manifest this story exactly as it had seized him, raw, unfiltered, and devoid of the sanitized distance typically found in cinema. He immersed himself in the visions of mystics like Catherine Emmerich, searching for the terrifying physical truth of the crucifixion that the modern world had forgotten. This search hardened into an unyielding conviction. Authenticity would be absolute. To preserve the staggering gravity of the moment, the film would use only ancient Aramaic and Latin, with no recognizable stars to distract from the divine narrative. Then came the most harrowing decision. Gibson would fund the entire project himself, risking tens of millions of his own money without a studio safety net. If the film failed, his collapse would be total. Yet, he did not hesitate. By this stage, the project was no longer a career choice, but a divine mandate. His preparation bordered on a holy obsession as the story began to consume his soul. As production commenced, Gibson confessed that something entirely unexpected began to follow him onto the set. Hold on a second. If you're finding value in this, consider liking and subscribing. Help Jesus Miracles grow so we can bring you more content like this. A profound heaviness descended upon the production, an atmospheric tension that defied definition. Certain sequences felt electrically charged, as if an invisible presence had infiltrated the space alongside the cast and crew. When the cameras began rolling in the rugged terrain of Matera, the environment shifted in ways that defied logical explanation. Gibson had anticipated the brutal physical hardships of the terrain and the punishing nature of the subject matter, but what he encountered was a different kind of pressure, one that forced seasoned professionals to pause and scan their surroundings as if they were being watched by an unseen eye. Experienced crew members reported sudden, causeless dizziness and a physical turning of the stomach. Some spoke of a crushing, overwhelming sorrow that seemed to emanate from no visible source. These were hardened professionals, yet they whispered about a presence for which they lacked the vocabulary to describe. As the depictions of the scourging and the crucifixion grew more intense, Gibson appeared to bear a weight far heavier than the rest. During these moments, He would frequently step away. Though many assumed he was seeking a director's perspective, he was actually found in deep prayer, his face often wet with tears. Each time he returned, his focus was sharpened into a razor's edge, as if he possessed an understanding of the mystery that the others could not yet articulate. Above them, the very sky seemed to mirror the instability of the production. Clear mornings would dissolve into darkness without a moment's notice. Scenes that began under steady sunlight were suddenly swallowed by dark clouds, rolling over the hills like a prearranged signal. Erratic winds surged without rhythm, knocking over heavy equipment and driving dust into the eyes of the crew until they staggered backward in the chaos. Then, with a suddenness that felt unnatural, the wind would collapse into a silence so absolute it was as if the air itself had paused to eavesdrop on the scene. The weather no longer behaved according to the laws of meteorology. It felt responsive, almost sentient. The most chilling moment occurred during the filming of the crucifixion itself. As Jim Caviezel hung elevated on the cross, fully exposed upon the hill to mirror the ancient reality of execution, a bolt of lightning struck him without warning. The sound of the strike split the heavens, and the set froze in a state of paralyzed shock. Though Caviezel remained on the cross, the electrical surge tore through his body with such violent force that he bit through his own tongue and cheek. In that chilling moment on the hill, those who witnessed the flash were paralyzed by an event that defied logic. It would later be revealed that the electrical surge inflicted long-term damage, necessitating 2 heart surgeries, including a procedure that required his chest to be opened. Surviving such a strike seemed improbable, yet before the initial shock could even be articulated, lightning descended from the heavens for a second time. This subsequent strike targeted assistant director Jan Michelini, an occurrence made even more unsettling by the fact that he had already been struck once before during the same production. 2 separate strikes on the same set, affecting the same small group of people, defied every statistical probability. While many attempted to cite atmospheric instability or weather patterns as an explanation, those standing on that ground felt a different reality entirely. It did not possess the randomness of an accident. It felt deliberate. Meanwhile, the physical toll on Jim Caviezel grew increasingly severe. During the scourging sequence, a leather whip intended to stop short of his body slipped, landing a genuine blow that tore a 14-inch wound across his torso. Later, while struggling under the massive weight of the wooden cross, he stumbled, causing his shoulder to dislocate. During the crucifixion scenes, freezing winds bit through his thin costume and body paint, pushing his system toward the brink of hypothermia. Mel Gibson would later confess that the agonizing screams captured on film were not a performance. They were the sounds of a man enduring genuine physical pain. Certain details began to weigh heavily on Gibson's mind. The actor's initials were J.C., and his age during the production was exactly 33. To a skeptic, these were mere coincidences. But to Gibson, the alignment felt too surgical to be ignored. This sense of a deeper, more profound orchestration lingered as filming continued under increasingly strained and supernatural conditions. Seasoned crew members reported sudden, searing fevers that materialized and vanished without medical explanation, while others were jolted from sleep by nightmares so vivid they left them trembling and disoriented. Even the most hardened professionals, those known for their emotional detachment, extras with no religious foundation, found themselves overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotion they could not name, their bodies shaking under a weight they could not define. This atmospheric heaviness followed the production like a shadow. It was never announced, yet it was felt by every soul on set. When the cameras finally stopped rolling in the rugged terrain of Matera, many expected this spiritual tension to dissipate like smoke after a fire. It did not. Instead, the strangeness merely changed its form. While Hollywood prepared for the standard machinery of press tours and controlled interviews, Gibson rejected the system entirely. He bypassed the traditional gatekeepers, taking the film directly into the heart of the community. Private screenings were held in quiet basements and modest sanctuaries. Pastors were the first to witness the vision. And soon, sermons began referencing the film months before its public debut. Congregations were warned to prepare their spirits for what was coming. What followed had no precedent in the history of cinema. Churches booked entire theaters. Buses were organized as screenings transformed into gatherings, then rituals, and finally, something resembling a mass pilgrimage. People did not attend merely to watch. They came to encounter something. Hollywood watched in stunned disbelief as the film slipped entirely beyond its control. This was not a marketing campaign, it was a mobilization. It was not hype, but a profound spiritual momentum for which the industry had no language and no model to contain. The film had ceased to behave like a commercial product. It had become a vessel. And for those paying close attention, one truth was undeniable. Whatever had begun on that hill, under unstable skies and an unnatural silence, had not stayed there. It had broken into the world, and it was moving with the force of a cosmic earthquake. Do not look away now, for the tremors of this event are still vibrating through our modern age, and the signs of a final restoration are appearing on the horizon. The narrative had crossed a sacred threshold, and once unleashed, there was no restraining its power. It moved outward like a living current, flowing into churches, into communities, and into the very fabric of individual lives. On the 25th of February 2004, the day of its release, The Passion of the Christ detonated all earthly expectations, amassing a staggering $23.5 million in a single day. These were figures typically reserved for massive superhero franchises and high-budget studio machines, not for an independently funded, subtitled religious work spoken entirely in ancient tongues. By the conclusion of its first weekend, the total had surged to $83.8 million. The analysts who had confidently dismissed the project as unmarketable were silenced. Some scrambled to revise their forecasts, while others simply retreated into the shadows. Week after week, the momentum refused to dissipate. This was not a success manufactured by advertising saturation or the muscle of a major studio. It was a movement fueled by word of mouth, passed from one person to another like an urgent message that had to be shared. Churches organized massive outings, and families returned multiple times with friends in tow. Entire communities treated the screenings not as entertainment, but as profound spiritual gatherings. By the end of its theatrical run, the film had earned approximately $370 million domestically and over $611 million worldwide. At that moment, it became the highest-grossing rated film in history, leaving Hollywood with no framework to explain what it was witnessing. The formulas the industry relied upon had collapsed in real time. However, this success arrived wrapped in fire. Almost immediately, a backlash ignited with an intensity that mirrored the box office records. Accusations of anti-Semitism began to dominate the headlines. The Anti-Defamation League publicly condemned the vision, warning that it could revive historical prejudices and reinforce harmful stereotypes. Abraham Foxman, a prominent voice for the organization, argued that audiences might interpret the narrative with a literalism that could fuel deep-rooted biases against Jewish communities. In regions where the scars of history remained tender, these concerns were far from academic. They were visceral and deeply personal. Gibson countered the rising storm by asserting that his work was a meticulous transcription of the Gospel accounts, neither seeking to embellish nor alter the sacred record. He stood firm in his conviction that he had introduced nothing intended to incite animosity or cast a shadow of collective guilt upon any people. Yet, his defense was a mere whisper against a gale. The discourse rapidly transcended the boundaries of cinema, spilling into the volatile arenas of theology, identity, and ancestral memory. The film was no longer a piece of entertainment. It had transformed into a cultural flashpoint, bifurcating audiences not by their artistic taste, but by the very foundations of their belief. Then, a new debate erupted over the sheer intensity of the suffering portrayed. Critics were not merely unsettled, they were alarmed. Some designated it the most violent mainstream production ever released into the public consciousness. Even the most seasoned reviewers, while recognizing the film's technical mastery and solemnity, noted with concern how the narrative was almost entirely consumed by a sustained, unrelenting display of agony. Others were far more biting, accusing Gibson of indulging in a visceral brutality that used physical trauma as a blunt force instrument to demand the viewer's submission. The reports emanating from the theaters themselves only added fuel to the fire. Accounts surfaced of audience members collapsing into unconsciousness during the most harrowing sequences. Paramedics were summoned to cinema halls as some viewers became physically ill, while others emerged from the darkness trembling, caught in a state of wordless sobbing. For many, the experience was described not as the act of watching a film, but as the endurance of a spiritual trial. The visceral reaction to the film only served to widen the existing chasm. For its supporters, the profound discomfort was the very essence of the experience, a necessary confrontation with a reality long ignored. For its detractors, no theological message could justify such an unrelenting focus on physical trauma. Across the globe, the response fractured along the jagged lines of history and culture. In Mexico, Italy, Poland, and Brazil, the film was met with a fervor that bordered on a religious awakening. In these nations, theaters overflowed, and the streets became arenas for deep, communal debate, as the film was hailed as a spiritual reckoning, a moment for collective introspection. In stark contrast, nations like France and Germany reacted with a defensive caution. Some theaters flatly refused to exhibit the work, while activists organized boycotts, arguing that the historical volatility of their own pasts made the film's themes too dangerous to revisit with such raw directness. As this controversy expanded, the lens of public scrutiny shifted with a punishing intensity toward Mel Gibson himself. The machinery of the press began to dissect his private life, resurrecting old interviews and reframing past remarks under a harsh, unforgiving light. Even the controversial statements of his father were pulled back into the public eye, woven into a narrative that Gibson insisted did not reflect his own convictions. This interrogation felt exhaustive, almost as if the film's unprecedented success had triggered a punitive response against its creator. The vision had shattered every record and divided audiences across every continent. But now it was pulling Gibson into the center of a widening storm. It became undeniably clear. Once this story was released, it refused to remain a mere piece of cinema. It had become a living, breathing force that was reshaping reality itself. The narrative demanded more than mere observation. It demanded a verdict. It seemed determined to prove that certain stories, once unleashed, continue to exact a heavy toll long after the screen fades to black. As the box office returns reached unprecedented heights, the scrutiny surrounding Mel Gibson intensified, with commentators circling him with increasingly sharpened questions regarding his motives, his creed, and his history. Neither admiration nor disdain for the film offered sanctuary from the storm. Everyone possessed a theory, and few were tempered with mercy. This was the origin of a deeper fracture. For those who labored on the Passion of the Christ did not emerge from the experience unaltered. The events that transpired during production followed them into their homes, their marriages, and their innermost lives, shifting their trajectories in ways that are rarely glimpsed and almost never discussed in the light of day. Gibson himself has confessed that the film left him permanently transformed. To the casual observer, its release appeared to be the absolute summit of his career, a singular triumph that secured his legacy in the annals of cinema. Yet, within the sanctuary of his private life, it signaled the commencement of a devastating unraveling. Only 2 years after the film's historic success, an arrest for driving under the influence triggered a catastrophic chain of events. A recorded outburst, laden with anti-Semitic rhetoric, disseminated instantly, evaporating years of public goodwill in a single night. The resulting scandal did not pause for nuance or context. It accelerated with a terrifying momentum, fueled by outrage and the machinery of public spectacle. Tabloids erupted into a frenzy. Leaked private recordings were dissected syllable by syllable, and headlines hardened into an unforgiving finality. Late-night monologues transformed his name into a universal shorthand for a total moral collapse. The response from the industry was swift and unmistakable. Stay with us, for as the world witnessed this public fall, a deeper spiritual lesson was being written, one that reminds us that the greatest battles are often fought in the silence following the storm. Invitations that once arrived in abundance ceased to manifest. Ambitious projects simply evaporated into the silence, and doors that were once wide open closed, without a single word of explanation. The very industry that had once championed his audacity now recoiled, treating him as a spiritual and professional liability that required absolute distance. To the casual observer, it appeared to be a masterpiece of self-destruction, a man systematically dismantling his own legacy under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Yet, beneath this cacophony of condemnation, a more profound interpretation began to circulate in hushed tones. There were those who believed that Gibson had paid a price of a different order, that by manifesting a story he felt divinely compelled to tell, he had triggered consequences that transcended mere reputation or career. While he has never articulated this as a formal grievance, his subsequent reflections have been cautious and filled with mystery. In rare interviews, he has lingered at the edges of the subject, implying that the sheer ferocity and scale of the backlash felt disproportionate, moving with a coordinated intensity that defied the logic of typical scandal. He never identified a specific culprit, nor did he point to anything material. Instead, he hinted that the forces descending upon him did not feel entirely human in their origin, as if his work had disturbed a spiritual equilibrium that could not be easily restored. Despite the years of exile, the public ridicule, and the long seasons of silence, he refused to abandon the narrative. In private, Gibson continued to labor on a sequel, moving with a methodical and quiet reverence. Those within his inner circle describe this ongoing process as an obsession rooted in the sacred. He treats the project as something volatile and heavy, a force he is not entirely certain can be safely unleashed, yet one he is spiritually incapable of discarding. In his mind, the story of the resurrection remains unfinished, and for a man who has already walked through the fire, walking away now would feel like an act of ultimate irresponsibility. The word resurrection means rising up from the dead. It is translated from the Greek word anastasis in the New Testament, which means rising up or standing again. The resurrection of Jesus from the grave is an undeniable fact of history. The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the focal point of the whole purpose of God with the human race. The Christian faith is built round it. Christianity exists upon the basis of Christ's resurrection from the dead. This was the driving force in the lives of the disciples in the 1st century A.D., main topic of the apostles' teaching. When the apostles chose another to take the place of Judas, they chose one, Matthias, who they said must be a witness with us of his Christ's resurrection. Acts 1, Volt 22. The apostles were imprisoned because they taught the people and preached through Jesus the resurrection from the dead. Acts 4 Volts 2. Paul was put on trial over the question of the hope and resurrection of the dead. Acts 23 Volts 6. Acts 24 Volts 21. The letters of the New Testament are full of teaching about the resurrection of Jesus and its importance for all of us. This was emphasized by the Apostle Paul when he said, "If Christ be not risen, then is our preaching vain, and your faith is also vain. Ye are yet in your sins." 1 Corinthians 15 Volts 14 and 17. Why did God raise Jesus? Earlier, studies have shown the work of Jesus as a sacrifice for sin. Hebrews 9 Volts 26. Study 4 explained how Adam brought sin and death to mankind by his disobedience to God's commands. In contrast, Jesus kept all God's commandments and lived a perfect life. The death of Jesus, however, could have no force at all as an effective sacrifice if he had not been raised from the dead. Jesus, made of a woman, made under the law, Galatians 4 Volts 4, came under the same condemnation of death that we have inherited from Adam. He personally was free from sin, therefore death could not hold him. Death hath no more dominion over him. Romans 6 Volts 9. God's love and justice. The righteous principles of God could not allow such a man, who had perfectly kept his laws, to remain subject to the law of sin and death. The Apostle Peter tells us, God raised him to life again, setting him free from the pangs of death, because it could not be that death should keep him in its grip. Acts 2 Volts 24 NEB. Study 3 showed how it was through the absolute justice of God, as well as through his love for man, that Jesus rose from the dead. For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. John 3 Volts 16. Was resurrection a new belief in the 1st century AD? We learn from the Bible that a rising again from the dead was the hope of the faithful in the ages before the time of Jesus. This is why Jesus said, Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it, and was glad. John 8 Volts 56. Peter quoted the words of David, king of Israel. I foresaw the Lord always before my face. Therefore did my heart rejoice, and my tongue was glad. Moreover also my flesh shall rest in hope. He, David, seeing this before, spake of the resurrection of Christ. Acts 2 Volts 25 to 26 and 31 compare Psalm 16, Volts 8 to 11. David also said, As for me, I will behold thy face in righteousness. I shall be satisfied, when I awake, with thy likeness. Psalm 17, Volts 15. The resurrection. A fulfillment of God's promises. As Study 5 pointed out, Abraham and David expected to be raised from the dead to enjoy the promises of God. They were not alone in this hope. Job said, I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God. Job 19 Volts 25 to 26. Isaiah said, Thy dead men shall live, Together with my dead body shall they arise. Awake and sing, ye that dwell in dust, and the earth shall cast out the dead. Isaiah 26 volts 19. Daniel was told that many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, and that he personally would rest in the sleep of death, and stand in thy lot at the end of the days. Daniel 12 volts 2 and 13. The Apostle Paul confirmed that this was the hope of those before Jesus. I continue unto this day, saying none other things than those which the prophets and Moses did say should come, that Christ should suffer, and that he should be the first that should rise from the dead, and should shew light unto the people. Acts 26 volts 22 to 23. Christ, the first, to rise to everlasting life. The Bible clearly shows that Jesus was the first to rise from the dead to immortality. Paul wrote, Our Saviour Jesus Christ, who hath abolished death, and hath brought life and immortality to light through the gospel. 2 Timothy 1 volt 10. Is resurrection the only hope of immortality? The life and immortality that Jesus has brought to light is the hope of a rising up from the dead to stand on the earth.